Gracias. Gracias. Bueno, yo creo que ya ahora sí estamos listos. Déjame ver acá. Carol and David, we are ready.
Okay, that's great. Well, you
Welcome to
probably
Colegio Los
could.
Nogales, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you for the opportunity to work with you. And David and I enjoy working together, so thank you for that opportunity as well. You can probably tell which one of us is Carol and which one of us is David, but I'm Carol and that's David. And I'm going to begin, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about where he's going to come in just a few minutes. My students used to tell me, well, let me back up one step. I was born in the southern part of the United States, where people have different accents than in the rest of the country. And my students used to tell me that I had the fastest Southern drawl they had ever heard. People in the South speak really slowly, and I seem to have the accent with speed that came from somewhere. So if I'm making you crazy because I'm talking too fast, can you make yourself pop up on the screen so I can see you? I mean, not right. Then what I was going to say is if I'm talking too fast and you need me to slow down, what I was going to say is if you can pop up on the screen and just kind of point to your mouth, I'll slow down. But if that doesn't work, you can try putting slow down in the chat box and maybe I'll see it come across the screen. Or Alex or David can just say, Carol, slow down, and I'll try to do that. Let me share my slides with you here so we'll have something to look at. Okay. Thanks to all of you for being here today. Your school leaders have been wonderful to work with. They've told us a lot about you and the work that you do in your school, which is all impressive. And I spent a good bit of time, at which David has as well. He got there before I did, but looking at your website in detail, and you'll see that I've picked up some things from your website in the presentation today. And there are great things happening there. So that makes it doubly nice to work with you in the sense that my expedition around the website made me understand that I was learning it probably as much or more than I'll be teaching. The session that we have with you today, you probably know we have a similar one tomorrow with elementary grades and a similar with middle school, and on the following day, Wednesday, with high school. And the content will be the same, but we'll be changing the illustrations so that the illustrations we use today will refer to the grades that you teach, and the illustrations we'll use in the subsequent 2 days will reflect the grade level that those teachers teach. This session today is planned to be an overview, kind of an introduction to differentiation, not in the sense that you don't know anything about it, because many of you do it well, but an introduction to my work with you and David's work with you in actually looking at classrooms and things that you do and other things that you might consider. So today is just kind of a big picture of differentiation, although there are some examples from classrooms in what I'm going to share today. In July, I will be back with you for longer periods of time. And the idea, is it August or July, Alex? One of those 2 times. I'll be back with you. And the purpose of those sessions.
En agosto, en agosto. Pues, principios de agosto, finales de julio.
The purpose of those sessions is really to look with you at the start of your school year and talk about some ideas that you might consider and let you have time to talk with each other, which you won't really have today, and to answer questions then, which we will also try to do today. That session or those sessions will be more hands-on, really thinking about, so how do I already do this? What could I add? What ideas does this illustration suggest? What am I seeing in this video that I might use? And so on. Today, welcome, by the way. what we want to do is to try to extend your understanding a little bit of what differentiation is, or at least what we think it should be. You may be aware of this, but there's a lot of different interpretations of differentiation, and some of them are very solid, and some of them are a little bit puzzling to me. And I have a real sense in my head of where this idea has come from, how it's evolved, why it is where it is, and David is certainly a big part of that. So I'm going to share with you my interpretation of it, and that'll let you sort of look at where you are and what you're thinking related to what I'm thinking and what David says to you. And we are planning to have about a 15-minute question and answer chunk at the end of today. So if you have questions that come up anytime during the day, put those in the chat. And at the end of the session, I think Alex will probably go through and choose some of those for us to address. The purpose of today is really to let you have some sense of where we're coming from with what differentiation is or what it should be, and to share a few examples of differentiation, the various parts of it that we'll introduce today, so you can see how some teachers interpret and apply those ideas. We want to share with you some research today, particularly from neuroscience, that illustrates why the principles of differentiation matter so much in today's schools. And David will be coming in the presentation twice, maybe about a quarter of the way through, and then maybe about 2/3 of the way through, to share with you some of those ideas. We decided that it was more coherent if he did that a couple of times rather than every time I finish saying something, he pops in and says something. So this is what we planned for today, and we can adjust another time if we need to. And particularly what I am hoping that he and I can do today is to be a catalyst for your thinking before the late summer sessions that we'll have, that will again focus on some strategies and practices of differentiation. So as you begin your school year, you can have the ideas that we're sharing with you in mind, and we'll have heard the same things that your colleagues hear, so it will work well for you to plan and debrief and reflect together. So I'm going to start today with why differentiation matters. And I don't really need to tell you this. You work in classrooms every day and you see what I see all the time. But I feel the need to be able to sort of frame this so you kind of know where I come from. And I guess I should tell you here that if you are familiar with my work, it probably says Carol Tomlinson from the University of Virginia. That was my second life. My first life was teaching a high school in a very rural, impoverished area of North Carolina. And then I directed a child development center. So I worked with early childhood a good bit and learned a huge amount from both of those places. And then I landed in middle school and stayed there for 21 years and loved every bit of all three of those places. I went to the university sort of by accident and was sure I wouldn't stay there very long, or certainly not as long as I'd stayed in K-12. But I fooled myself and stayed there for 30 years. So as you can tell, I'm kind of old if you couldn't tell that from the hair. But I have been around the block a lot and seen lots of schools in lots of places and learned from so many teachers in their classrooms. I have always felt like I was a K-12 teacher. At the university, I was delighted to have the chance to do research and learn from the research of other people. That was really important to my thinking. Very fortunate to travel around the world and talk with teachers in different places. But at heart, I'm still a classroom teacher, always have been, always will be. So why differentiation matters has to do with who's coming to school these days. And that's one of the things David's going to talk with you about in his first conversation with you. But I want you, as I make some print come up on the screen, to either kind of count on your fingers or make hash marks on a piece of paper and see how many of these students who I'll represent on the screen, how many categories of these students do you teach? Do you have 3 categories in your classes? 4, 6, all of them? Do you ever have kids who learn at different rates, different speeds? Do you have students who have difficulty sitting still and paying attention sometimes or all the time? Do you ever have any students who have home challenges? Some of them we don't even know about, of course. Some are temporary. A new baby brother showed up, and the kid who was the senior child in the house is now sort of destroyed because the throne has been emptied. Sometimes parents or children are ill. Sometimes jobs went away. So many things can happen that makes home stressful, and that comes to school with the kids. Do you have any kids that just sort of see themselves as average? I'm nothing special. I can't do anything really special. I'm just kind of a regular kid. Any who need support in learning the language of the classroom as you're also teaching the content of the classroom. In other words, speakers of languages other than the language of the classroom. Do you have any students who work well in advance of the grade level that they're in or the age? Any students who are ever rejected by their peers, don't want them in their groups, or teased or bullied, or just stay away from them, not comfortable with them? You ever have any students who march to a different drummer? What I mean by that is they're fine, they're good, they're really a lot of fun sometimes, but and they do things in life that are interesting. They make things, they learn things, they're always excited about what they're reading, but their agenda is just different than the school agenda. And they sometimes look like they're confused by what's going on in the classroom and why we're doing what we're doing. They're just different little critters. Students from varied cultures. How about students who love to talk a lot, all the time if you'd let them, or any students that you teach who would prefer never to speak in class? They don't like it, they're afraid of it, they're embarrassed by it, they're worried about what they do or don't know. Do you teach any students ever who have significant gaps in math or language literacy? Those are the foundational building blocks, as you know, because you have a lot of responsibility for those things. Ever have any kids with gaps in those areas? How about any students who have emotional challenges? Any students who are very independent? I'll do this on my own. Don't need you. Go away. I'm fine. I can get this done. Don't bother me. Or any students who are very dependent, sort of immature in that way. What did you just say? Where should I put this paper? Do you like this? Is this the right thing? Or students that are very mature for their age, physically, emotionally, academically, or students who are very immature for their age in any one of those three ways. I can't see all of you, but it would be interesting to know if we could see each other, how many of these you say you encounter with some regularity in your classes. In some places where I'm there with people and people can raise their hands and we look around at each other, there are a fair number of people who say they have them all. But any of these students that you teach are different significantly in some important ways than other students that you teach. And so once we have moved past in our time in history, classrooms where everybody was pretty much alike in background experience, in confidence, in language, in socioeconomic level, in maturity level, which never was the case on that one. But we're in a time where this is our world. This is who we teach. And David's going to talk with you about this in a minute, but these students differ significantly in ways that impact their learning. And as long as we teach them as though they're all alike, then we fail too many of them. Those of you, well, all of you are in the lower grades, and teachers in the lower grades tend to be much more aware of the differences and much more plugged in to trying to do things consistently that help all these kids move forward vigorously. But that's a tough job, and it's why it's important, I think, to revisit and continue studying this notion of differentiation, because working in classrooms with many of these students together is not an, oh yeah, I did that, I've got it now and I'm finished. It's a lifelong pursuit, I think, in our careers. The idea that we can teach the class is actually a myth. The idea that we can stand in front of them and tell them something, and they record it in their heads, and it comes out on a piece of paper, and we've all got it, never was true. And it is absolutely not true in our schools now. So the idea of differentiation is really continuing to say to us, so what can you do about that? How well are you doing it? How do you know who it's working for, who it's not, why it's working or not? As you grow in your knowledge of students and in knowledges of ways to deal with those things, you can see yourself growing. And equally important, of course, you can see your students, more of them, growing as much as they possibly can. John Hattie is, I think, probably the leading researcher in education around the world. He's a British fellow, British, I think. And his work is now 2 decades long, studying hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies that tell us what makes positive difference in kids' learning. That's really what he looks at, is what is it that we do in the classroom that we think benefits kids, and how much does it actually do that? And here's a comment that he made in a book that he wrote, was published last summer. Classrooms are places where variance has become the norm. Those differences are absolutely normal. There are fewer classes where all students are of the same ethnicity, same achievement level, same socioeconomic background, and the same age, working with an age-appropriate curriculum. Thus, he says, differentiation needs to be the major principle in all teaching. And excellent teaching encompasses the key principles and practices of differentiation. He is saying, when my team and I, as we've looked at those thousands of studies and digested and synthesized what they're telling us is you can't teach the class as a whole much of the time and get where you need to get. Those differences matter, and we need to teach with them in mind. Again, I'm not thinking that's a real shock to your system to hear that. I just want to sort of start off with that premise. So what is differentiation, or what should it be if we were doing it in the way that it's envisioned, in the way that is rooted in the best research that we have from brain science, which David's going to talk with you about, from psychology, from philosophy, from sociology, from pedagogy, and from observing in classrooms, just the art of teaching and looking at that. Differentiation, for me, at its core, means, first of all, placing the students at the center of all decision making. When you sit down to plan, in your head that you're seeing the faces and the names, and you're saying, not how much am I supposed to cover this week in order to finish everything in time, not what's most fun for me to do, although it's not bad for you to be teaching things that are fun to you, but if it's fun to you and not to them, that's another story. Thinking about the strengths that those kids bring to you, and the dreams that they have, and the experiences that they can share with the class and make the class richer, but also those challenges that they bring with them. And saying always, not where do I start tomorrow and how do I get finished with this planning, but who are these people? And given who they are, what can I do with these ideas I need to share to reach them the best? So the first step, which is a big one for a lot of us because there are many pressures on us, is not looking at an individual and saying, who is this kid and what can I do to make sure she grows as much as possible? It's saying, wait a minute, don't get ruled by a schedule or the sense that it's taking the teacher next door to you a little bit longer to do this than it is you, or a little bit shorter, or I just don't have time to do anything, so I'll just, throw this together and go out there, which I doubt that very many of you do much of the time. All of us do it occasionally. But all of those things should always, as much as possible, take a back seat to who are these human beings? How well do I really understand them? How can I understand them better? And how can I bring that knowledge to my planning and to my teaching? So the students first, but as quickly as you can move from there, you kind of flip the circle, and then it becomes, what about this student? And in this stuff that we're studying now, in the things that I'm planning now, what does this student bring that strengthens us? What are his challenges? How can I address that? How do I help kids work together to share with one another in ways that strengthen them as individuals? So differentiation is a student-centered model, learner-centered model. And it really means ultimately putting the student, thinking about that one unique human being when you're planning. I want to share with you a couple of definitions of differentiation. These are not too exciting, but they're maybe kind of useful. The first one's especially useful. One way of looking at differentiation is that it's shaking up the classroom from what we've always done, just shaking it up so it's going to be different, so that you're giving kids more ways to take in information than you have been using in the past, more ways to make sense of that information, and more ways for them to show us what they've learned. For those of you who are fairly new to differentiation, or for some of you who haven't really sort of considered its big picture, this wouldn't be a bad thing to work on for a year. I'm going to learn about these kids as fast and as accurately as possible. I'm going to use what I learn in planning. And as a result of that, I'm going to try to do three things regularly. Give kids a lot more ways to encounter, hear, see represented the information that I'm trying to share with them. I'm going to give them lots more ways to make sense of what they're doing. When it quits just being input and starts being sense making, have to own it. You have to go through it so it makes meaning in your brain. What are all the ways that I can help them make meaning? And then finally, when it's time, whether it's formatively or summatively, for kids to show you what they know, can I give them 2 different ways to show, or 3 or 4 or 2, and say to them, and if you have another idea for how you'd like to show it, please share that with me, and it'll probably work. So that's kind of the crux of differentiation in a slightly more practical way. This definition seems real simple, but it's actually not. Differentiation is creating conditions in your classroom that are the most likely to maximize the academic growth of students, the intellectual growth, the affective or emotional growth, and the social growth of each learner in that classroom. Again, because you are early childhood teachers, you are likely to be more attuned to all those areas than many teachers are, because you see all of it unfold in front of you every day and you see the connections between those areas. But what we're really trying to say is, this kid is really quick with reading and understands reading deeply, but he's afraid of the other kids, whether he's afraid to be rejected or feels just shy, or the language issue is bothering him, but he's really not very good at being in more than just by himself. Maybe okay in a pair, but not even that all the time, and bigger group problem. That's a student who needs to grow emotionally and socially as much as he's growing academically. So that's one of 1,000 illustrations of sort of asking yourself about each student and seeing where they are, and watching all the time, all year long, which is great fun, of course, to watch them change in these areas. But looking at all these things and saying, what can I do in the classroom? How can I create any kind of condition that's most likely to help each student grow as much as they possibly can in all 4 of these areas? I'm going to look at this a little bit more when we're together later. But differentiation to me truly is anything you can do in a classroom to make learning better for kids. And so we'll be looking through that lens a good bit, including today. So the aim of differentiation, you see some of your kiddos there. I had a great time looking and cutting and pasting and trying to decide which things to use. They are wonderful activities that you had with the kids in class and beyond the classroom. The aim of differentiation is really what I just said to you. It asks us to do everything in the classroom we can to make it as successful as possible for each individual in that class, as well as for the class as a whole. And you will hear me say several times while we're together today and after this, the 5 classroom elements all of us have in our classrooms. We may never have named them. We may never have thought about them this way, but they're there in everybody's classroom. What do you do with your learning environment that invites every kid to be successful? What do you do with your curriculum? You've got maybe some marching orders that you have through a standard curriculum that comes with being an international school, but you ought to be tweaking that in lots of ways to make it a good fit for the kids. What can you do with your curriculum to make it more compelling, more evoking of curiosity? What can you do with your assessment practices that make them stronger for each student, that make each student stronger, and that help you teach better? What can you do when you move from curriculum to actually teaching to the instruction? What are all the ways you could teach something? And which one works better for whom? And why is that the case? And which ones don't work as well for some kids? And who are they? And why is that the case? And then, of course, if anybody knows this, teachers of early childhood do know this, you have to teach kids to live in an organized, peaceful, productive way in the classroom. And so you have to help them understand that this is their place and that you need to all work together to make it a better place for everybody, and that you want them to be your partners in that. And that means we're going to have to figure out what to do when we end a class period before something else starts. We're going to have to learn how to get materials when we need them from a place that's not on our table and how to put them back appropriately. Going to have to learn how to talk with one another in ways that encourage learning rather than discouraging it. Going to have to think about how to arrange the furniture in the classroom so that it helps things like students' differences in many ways, but also helps collaboration. So differentiation, when I say to you, differentiation's about creating conditions in a classroom that maximize learning opportunity for each kid. What I really mean by that, these are the areas in which we can work. What do we do with each of these things to make the classroom more productive? What John Hattie would say, what do we do to make it more invitational for each student? So what we're trying to do is work with those elements in the most positive ways that we can, in the most productive ways that we can, with flexibility. So not expecting all the same stuff to happen all the time for every student, so that we can support every student in trying to maximize their academic, intellectual, affective, and social capacity. In many places where I am, it appears that teachers have kind of gotten the notion, and I see where this comes from, it's logical, but have kind of gotten the notion that instruction is that differentiation is a set of strategies. If I know how to do learning centers, if I know how to do learning stations, if I know how to do inquiry with kids, if I understand how to use technologies, those strategies are differentiation. Those things all fit pretty much in that instruction piece. And that's a big deal because instruction matters a lot in classrooms, but those other things are powerful too. So we'll be looking at some ways to think about those areas. Here's my most, I guess, comprehensive definition of differentiation quickly, and then we'll have chances to look at it later. We need, this is referring back to that list I just showed you. We need to create an environment that's invitational to kids, that makes them want to come in, to feel whole and welcomed and known and challenged and supported. Because an environment encourages kids to take the risk of learning. But learning is risky. You make mistakes. Sometimes people don't think you're smart, or sometimes they think you're weird because you see things differently. Or maybe you have a lot of pressure at home to be really perfect all the time. And that learning thing is kind of scary. And when kids come into a place that feels safe and it feels like theirs, that really is the spark plug for learning. We want to shape curriculum. Somebody gives us stuff that we call a curriculum, but we can shape that to be more relevant to kids, to be more attuned to their lives and experiences and dreams. We can shape the curriculum so that we're more about understanding things than we are just about covering things. We can shape the curriculum to be focused on what's more important rather than doing everything. We can make it more engaging by doing certain things, and we can give it a real purpose. Kids can see why it matters in the world. We can use assessment to judge students, but we can also decide that we'd rather mentor them through assessment rather than judge them. And that's a much better way to go. Your common sense and experience, I suspect, would affirm that. So how do we use assessment to help us learn better, teach better, and help our students become more autonomous in their learning? What does that look like, rather than assessment as kind of a judgment thing much of the time? How do we create instruction that's responsive to students' strengths and their interests and their cultures and their needs and their fears, and that is collaborative and active and joyful much of the time? Or when it's not joyful because it was just really hard, trying to make sure that it was at least satisfying when we finally got to a place where we could tell we were making progress. And finally, how do we become a leader of students so that they see us as somebody who wants to work with them to make that the best classroom ever? And they're our partners in it. And we have to figure out together how to make routines happen that make things work for everybody, and that we have some conditions, some processes, some procedures in class that are pretty much going to be alike much of the time. But we also need some procedures and processes that give us a chance to be flexible. And we need to figure that out together. I found this graphic online once and I love it. For me, this is a visual of what we're doing when really great teaching happens. What we do in the learning environment improves our instruction. And what we do in instruction improves the learning environment. And what we do with assessment improves both of those things. And what we do in terms of leading kids makes all that possible. And those things turn together. It's sort of like everything is part of a well-organized, really powerful system. And I don't think we get that all day, every day. I don't think many of us get that, every time we turn around, everything in here was perfect today. I don't think that's the point, but because it doesn't happen very often. But understanding what this means and how it works is a good way to start. So the brain means David's coming here in a minute. And we also, this time around, decided that it would make, he's been sharing his slides and I've been sharing mine, and it seems more economical for us to have one set of slides. So we're going to try today with my being his slide mover, and we'll see how I do. So here's David. You want to tell me when to put this one on, David? I won't put it up until you're ready for it.
Right, let me do a little intro first. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here, especially happy to work with a school like Los Nogales that is committed to doing more and better work with its students, to make more students successful, to look at different ways in which teachers can engage with their students and have the students engage with their learning. My task, well, let me go back for a moment. I've been a high school teacher. I've been a college professor. I've been an administrator, but my real love is science. And I got very excited about 25 years ago, maybe a little bit more, believe it or not, about some of the things we're learning from brain research. And I wondered at that time, and I ran into a few people who were looking at it as well, and we talked about the possibility of seeing if some of the things neuroscience is learning as we look more and more into the living brain, thanks to scanning technologies, if any of the things we're learning could help teachers who, after all, work with the human brain every day, be more successful. And whether or not some of the things that we learn explain why things happen in the classroom. Too often in the past, when we've done professional development, in my experience, and I did that for many years, as well, is that we provided the what to do and the how to do it. We never really understood the why because we couldn't look inside the human brain to see what was going on. Neuroscience research and brain imaging has allowed us to gain some incredibly important information about how the brain learns. And my job has been to look at that information and see what of that can be helpful to teachers and educators in the classroom, how it can help to advance teacher and student effectiveness. So with that in mind, we've known for many years that different students, different brains. We got that mainly from watching behavior because we couldn't look inside the brain. We watched our kids behave and we came to the conclusion, well, this is that kind of kid, and this is this kind of kid, and this is that kind of kid, and this is a fast learner, this is a slow learner, this is a kid who's very engaged, this is a kid who's very aloof, mainly from watching their behavior. But then, as we began to get more and more information from neuroscience, we began to realize what makes them different. What is going on inside that brain that is making them different? So we've known for a long time different brains, different students. So Carol, first slide.
Yep.
So we've said that the brain is uniquely organized. That organization is influenced by the genetic code we inherit from our parents and by experience from the world around us. Remember that the brain's main job is to keep us alive. And it does that by constantly monitoring the environment to see whether anything in the environment can help us in order to stay alive, to learn things that can help him stay alive, and to learn things for him to be successful in whatever he wants to do. Even the brains of identical twins are different because the networks that they establish begin to put things together in a different way. Some things become more important to one twin than the other. It doesn't take long. In fact, we believe that by the time these kids reach the age of 6 years, their brains are quite different. They may look alike outside, on the outside, but the inside of the brain is very different. Next slide. Stop right there. The question we want to ask now is, how rapidly is the brain changing? And something has happened in the recent years that has caused the brain, especially the brains of your students, because your students are the youngest of the school and their brains are more plastic, more able to make changes rapidly. So the greatest environmental impact on teaching and learning in recent years has been what? What's been the greatest impact? Here it is. Technology. Technology in the last 10 years has become such an integrated part of our society. And the kids are interacting with it younger and younger. Next slide. So they're starting to interact at the age of 2, 3. The toys. If you go into a store that sells toys, look at the toys. So many of them have engagement activities where the student has to press a button, press this, make this sound, do that. So they start to get involved at a very early age with technology. That can be a good thing, but what we have observed now is that there are some not so good things. And as teachers of the youngest brains, I think it's important for you to keep in mind that the brain crossing into the threshold into your classroom today is very different from the brain of 5 years ago. And the brain is also very different from the brain that will cross the threshold 2 or 3 years from now. Why? Because technology is having such an incredible impact on how the brain grows, develops, sets up networks, interacts with its environment, interacts with its caregivers, and interacts with learning. Next slide. So research studies are showing how does technology affect student brains. And we've got now about 10 years of study to see how the brains of kids have been changing over those years. And we find that they are changing in 4 areas, and changing rapidly. One area is attention. The technology allows the student to change their topic that they're looking at very quickly. In fact, let me get my own digital device out. And what kids do, they go to something, no, I don't like that. They move on to the next thing. So it takes a lot to keep their attention because there's always something else happening. Now, the question is, does this mean their attention span is getting shorter? I know teachers tend to believe that. The answer is no, at least not yet. We have no evidence that the attention span is getting shorter. The evidence we have is that there are more outside issues trying to get their attention. You have email, you have the different social media, you have homework, you have all of the kinds of things that would attract their attention from their outside world. So the attention span has not shortened because once they find something that they really enjoy, they'll spend hours with it. So this means the implication for the classroom is that the teacher has to work harder to decide what kinds of what kind of instructional strategies will I need to recognize that the student's attention is getting more impacted by things around them, and that will vary among the students. So the attention span, the ability to keep attention, to keep focus, will vary among all the students. Next. The next thing is memory. Yes, technology is affecting our memory, especially our temporary memory, which we call working memory. The capacity of working memory, which we used to say for preschool kids and kindergarten, used to be about 5 items. That is, we used to say that the students of preschool and kindergarten can hold about 5 things in their temporary memory, which we call working memory, at the same time. Now we're finding that number is going down. Why? We don't know for sure, but what we think is this. We used to, in schools, before we had so much technology, students had to remember things up here in their brain. So they needed the working memory capacity to store things, to hold things, so that they could eventually store it to long term. Now what we think is happening is that students are using the digital device more and more, as well as adults, by the way, to store information that they used to keep in their head. And if you don't use the working memory, then it begins to lose its capacity. So the implications for the classroom is that teachers should use instructional strategies and techniques in the classroom that keep the students engaged in such a way that they need to use their own memory and not resort to this. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying don't use technology in the classroom. What I'm saying is limit its use. Use the technology up here more than the technology here. The third area is thinking skills. When I went to school many years ago, and the teacher said, all right, students, let's see if we can find another way of solving this problem. So they said, go into your groups. And so we would go into a group of 3 or 4 other students, and we would talk to each other to see if we can find a way, another way, other than was taught in the classroom, another way to solve a problem. And we would bang our heads together and exchange stories and exchange information in an effort to find the solution, a new solution. This was very helpful for brain development because it forced us to recognize that other people have different ideas, have different notions about ways to solve a problem. That was very good because it expanded each individual student's understanding of ways to look at how to solve a problem. What we're finding now is that when the teacher says, okay, students, go into your groups and let's see if you can find a way to solve a problem, what they do is they go here, they Google it, to see how someone else has solved the problem. Oh, that's one way to do it. So instead of using the information in their own head and combine information with other students in the group to solve the problem and practice higher order thinking, instead, once again, they're letting the digital device do the thinking and show them how somebody else solved it. So I will repeat, remember, use technology as an end, not as an end unto itself, but as a means to achieve an end, but not to replace what the students should be doing up here. And I think the last one, many of you will know, social behavior. Digital devices are changing the way kids interact with their world around them. Before we had these devices, students had to interact with their parents, with their caregivers, with other students, with their peers, with their teachers, in order to gather information, to solve problems, and to understand themselves emotionally, culturally, socially, and so on. And so relationships with the outside world were very person-driven. You connected with your parents, you connected face-to-face with a caregiver, you connected face-to-face with your peers, you connected face-to-face with the teachers and with other members of the community. Today, what we're finding, so students at that point learned that relationships were face-to-face, that they were personal. What we're finding now, of course, and I'm sure all of you are well aware, that now social media has taken the place of the face-to-face interactions. And kids are learning, the young brains that you deal with are learning that relationships are device-centered, me with a device, rather than me with a person. And so as a result of that, you know what happens? It's easier for them to bully somebody. It's easier for them to be bullied. It's easier for them to say things in a message, social message, that they wouldn't say to someone's face, because face-to-face is very different than being face to a digital device. So I think it's critical to keep in mind that the young brain, the younger the brain is, the easier it is to change and set up new networks. Carol, next slide. So because each brain is so uniquely organized and being more so by technology, the idea that just one size fits all, that one curricular or instructional assessment program fits all students is just not brain compatible. It's not realistic in terms of what we're learning about how the brain, the young brain particularly, is interacting with its world. Especially with the increasing diversity, I'm sure you experience it in your own classrooms. You're getting kids of greater diversity, of different cultures, even different languages. And those change among the kids in your group. You can't use one size fits all. And that's because, Carol, that's because of brain plasticity. The idea that the brain is constantly changing, reorganizes itself, is learning because of input from its environment. And that environment in preschool and kindergarten is essentially teacher and the peers around them. Some of those kids spend more time interacting with you than they do with their own parents or caregivers. Because at home, it's so easy for the parent to say, here you are, play with your toy, leave me alone, I gotta cook dinner, instead of interacting with them. So the teacher's place has always been important. The teacher is a brain changer and always has been a brain changer. Now, in order to change those brains, it has to recognize that they're very different, becoming more different, more diverse. And so differentiation and instruction becomes really important. Carol, I think that's it, isn't it?
Okay.
Yes.
So
Thank
in
you.
about 1 minute, I'm going to give you a little bit of a brain break, but let me just sort of summarize here. Before I do this, I'm going to say David might have seen it too, but this morning I just happened to see on one of the networks here in the US, an interview with the United States Surgeon General, which is the highest medical post that's an official one in the United States. And what he was talking about was the fact that wherever he goes, which was not true in past years, the question that parents are asking him over and over and over is, how do we manage the devices? We don't know what to do with them. They've taken us over. We don't know how to get the kids' life back. We don't know how to organize our time. If we tell the students they can't have time on the devices, they cry and say, well, they'll be the only ones and they'll be the odd man out. And all of the participants in that show were saying exactly the same thing, including the moderators that are usually there. It's gotten so big and it has changed so many things. And what David's saying is really central to teaching and learning. Summary again, though, here, what differentiation's asking us to do is to use these elements in the best way possible, and with what we know about how kids learn from brain science, from other kinds of research as well, so that we can reach out in the most positive and productive ways to those very, very, very different brains. So we're going to do a brain break for a couple of minutes because you need to stand up for a minute or breathe. Not going to give you enough time to go get a cup of coffee or, go in the other room and make the bed from this morning or anything, or get your stuff together at school. Just enough to think for a minute, to stand up and breathe. And maybe most importantly, if you have a question you'd like to pose to one of us for the Q&A at the end, this would be a good time to put that in the chat box as well. So I'm going to disappear for just a minute, and time for maybe about a minute and a half, and then we'll get back together and start again. Hey, we will start back in a very brief second. So if you can hear me and get yourself situated again, that would be great. Those of you who turned off your screen, if you would be game for turning it back on, it's really helpful to me to be able to see some of you at least, and that may be true for David as well. So if you turned your screen off and you'd be game for turning it back on, please do. Great, I see faces. That's lovely. Thank you. So what I'm going to do with you now, watching my time very carefully because David needs some more time and we need some Q&A time, is to briefly share with you a few thoughts about what it means, what each of those 5 classroom elements would look like if we could get it really right. And most of us get a lot right. Most of us who want to keep learning get more and more right all the time. But what would a learning environment look like that was really a catalyst for learning for other students? I'm going to try to do that 5 times, but if I don't, we'll be able to circle back when we're together the next time. Here's what research tells us makes a learning environment feel invitational to a kid. A teacher who comes into that classroom every day, despite the fact that it's tiring sometimes, with a vision for making a positive difference in each kid's life. A teacher who really believes that every kid has way more capacity than we can see, and who teaches with that sense that kids can do almost anything we ask them to under the right conditions. A teacher who makes it a primary responsibility to know each student better and better every day so we can teach them better, to forge trust with each student, to help the kids learn early in the year and continue to prove the point that you are absolutely trustworthy. Make opportunities for kids to learn to trust each other so they become like members of a really good team that play together for a common good outcome. And then moving from thinking about teacher-student and student-student to building that team of learners, building a community of learners so that the kids are far more than just students who come to school and sit there together every day. They really lift one another up. Helping those kids become our partners in successful teaching and learning, because it's a lot to do to make everything happen all the time. There's a lot of that students can do. And when they do, they own the endeavor much more. In other words, making success a shared endeavor. So I want to show you a couple of things that I see in some places I've been or things I've learned about that look like a teacher who's trying to do these things. This is an example of a third grade class where the teacher said to them early in the week, this is our place, and we need to decide who we want to be here and what we want this place to be like. And so at the beginning of the year, for a week, maybe a little bit more, they spent a chunk of time every day talking about ways that they wanted to live together. Not what are rules in here that we have to follow, but who do we want to be? How do we want to live together? And in the end, after they'd had lots of conversations and debates, here's what they said. Always choose kindness. When you make a mistake, apologize and try to make it right. Tell the truth. Build people up. Be positive, be inclusive, be a good example for others. That was in life. In school, be engaged, be an active learner. Always do your best. Be curious, be a learner and a teacher. I don't know about you, but I think those things are really powerful, and those were generated by the students. And the teacher said to them, we've talked about these a lot, this is the list. If you're game for being part of a community that lives by these rules, sometime when you have a few minutes, come and look at them again and then sign your name around the edge of the rules. That's a great way for kids to start together, seeing one another as part of a team, figuring out what they need to do to trust one another, to see the teacher trusting them enough to encourage them to do this. Here's another class of students who were a little bit younger, and they debated what they thought they wanted to live by in their classroom. And they talked and narrowed down some of their content ideas, and then they put them on strips and posted those on the board. And at various points, the kids illustrated what they thought the different ideas meant. And so their pictures are illustrations of their understanding of it. And finally, they took a vote and decided which of the rules they had, which of the guidelines to live by were the most important. And the teacher said when the votes were tallied, the kids stood up and clapped because they felt like they owned it. They were so proud of what was there and they really liked the outcome. This is something that I have seen many times, and this teacher is a great example for me. I've never met him, but I see his work often. From the very first day in school with these first graders, the kids are in groups like this, sitting side by side on a rug. Some of them may decide to sit in a book area. Some of them may be at their tables. Sometimes they'll be sitting in twos, or some of them will, and others will be working alone, and there might be a group of three somewhere. And whatever they're learning during the day, there's time to work together in groups like this so that the kids are doing most of the work and the teacher can roam around and talk with them and listen and learn about them really well. But it's okay, we're going to figure this out. Here's what we need to do. How can we do this? Why'd you say that way? Let's look at it this way. And what they find is that, again, school, the time goes by fast. They learn about one another. They learn better because the brain is having some reinforcement. And when the kids get a little older, it works just as well. And when they get a lot older, they ought to be on their feet doing that all the time that's possible. Now, because kids were under such stress in many places in COVID and really appear in many schools to come back being in some distress, and this has been true before, but I've been surprised at the number of places I've seen where teachers have done something like this. Some teachers call it a chill zone or a peace corner or a quiet corner. They've put a place in the classroom that isn't assigned to anybody. It's just a place that you can go if you need to think quietly and the action in the room is too much for you, if you have a headache, if you're sad about something, if you need to move away from a peer group before things begin to get antsy and you know that you need to take yourself somewhere for a minute and kind of calm down. The one on the top is for young children, as you can see, has things on the wall that relates to what they're studying, things in the basket that kids can work with. And this little guy has decided when he's there to do some coloring or drawing. Picture may have significance with why he's there, but might not. The lower picture is exactly the same thing in a high school room. And I have heard several teachers say this year that they have now found that those things work so well that they have decided they need to have a second spot in the classroom, so that if 2 or 3 or 4 kids want to do something like that, need to do something, it's there for them. What do we do with curriculum? These should look familiar to you too. What do we do with curriculum that makes kids want to learn? Well, one of the things that we know is really important, and I suspect this is front and center in a lot of your work, that we have very clear learning goals. And because you're involved with international curriculum, I'm guessing that you have goals that say what kids should know, which is the K, what they should understand, which is the U, and what they should be able to do, which is the D. It's really important that we have those clear KUD goals, that the kids know what knowledge is most important, what understandings are most important, and what skills are most important. And that means if we're not going to overload the brain completely, we have to be able to sort of crystallize in our heads of all the things that we're working with, what matters most for their growth and development. David will talk with you more about this in a little bit, but we need to be planning that curriculum to engage students so that they really want to stick with it, even if their mind is going off to some device someplace. Engagement means the work is relevant to them and their lives and their experiences and their dreams and hope, and that it has meaning for them in a personal way. We need to be sure that we're focusing our work on student understanding more than just on student memorizing and giving back. In the early grades, there's a lot of work that needs to be done foundationally, of course, with literacy and math and other things. But even then, it's really important for kids to see that translated into something that helps them get, oh, that's what that means, or oh, that's how you'd use it in this thing that I'm writing to my parents about. In the end, I suspect you've studied this as well. We need to be teaching so kids can apply what they've learned and can even transfer it to situations that they've never seen before. And I think we'll probably talk about this last idea next time we're together or shortly thereafter. When you sit down to plan and you're looking kind of at where the whole class is going, sometimes I would sit and think, so who am I thinking about now when I start this planning? Am I thinking about the kids who are really hurting and struggling and having a really hard time keeping up, attaching to what we're learning? Those guys need my help, so maybe I should start planning for them first. Or some people say, well, I'm going to start with the kids I was assigned to teach. I'm going to start with the grade level students, the students who are about where you'd expect them to be developmentally in those various areas. Occasionally, but not really often, in my experience, a teacher will say, I'm going to start planning for the fastest learners, the most adept learners, the most excited learners in my class. And here are very cool things I could ask them to do. If any of you have worked with planning for students who are really advanced, that we sometimes call gifted, that's really what we're about with them, coming up with dynamic things for them to do and to learn and to experience and to try out. My vote goes to that third group that's kind of rare. I'm going to plan first for those kids who are way out there as learners, and I'm going to plan things that they would get really engaged in and hands-on things that they can do that have real meaning for them. And then I'm going to differentiate, not by teaching down, not ever by dumbing something down, but by building ladders of support so that all of the kids can have access to that core, really amazing stuff. That has such a powerful influence on student growth. And we'll talk about that in a bit. So what might it look like in a classroom where, I don't think I put this in here. I'm sorry. I'll do that again with you another time. But what I did see in many of your examples on your website are, in fact, places where I see kids who are using what they learned, and they have to understand it to be able to use it. I see many things that you've generated for them to actually do, to be a part of, that are just flat out engaging. If I were a kid, I'd be really psyched about that stuff. So for example, the thing on the left here is, I want to be there. I want to know where those things came from. I want to know who made them and why they made them and what they're doing with them. And I'm looking at all my friends going through and looking at these same things, or kids that are visitors coming to look at what we did because we created something that's worth their time. Or the kids on the right who are really using ideas in a broadcasting kind of setting. We can teach the K's and U's and D's. We can teach the stuff in dynamic contexts that make a real difference to kids. And I see evidence of that in your school. The trick becomes to keep doing it, to making it stronger and better and exciting for the kids and exciting for us too. Assessment practices. In the earlier grades, we're not usually quite as addicted to things with grades on them, although by grade 3 and 4 and 5, we're getting pretty addicted. What can we do that makes assessment, again, dynamic for kids, that they have real audiences sometimes? How can we arrange our assessment so that they learn early on that making mistakes is just a part of learning? And in fact, that's good stuff because it helps you know how to learn better. Here are some of the things that we hope we can do in terms of assessment practices. I'll let you read this one yourself. In my own teaching, this was my weakest area for a long time. In my own defense and the defense of my colleagues that I worked with, there wasn't all the conversation about formative assessment than there is now. So we were just kind of on our own. But it didn't occur to me for a very long time that if everything is graded, it all becomes about a grade. If grades are intimidating and kids are scared to go home with them, or if parents are so uptight about what their kid's score is that that's all they can focus on, our teaching is diminished. And so trying to use formative assessment in the foreground to help us coach kids on how to learn better and to help them learn the skills of communication and presentation, of sharing their work with people is really, really important and helpful. Here's an example of a pre-assessment that a group of kindergarten teachers used. And it has kind of an interesting story behind it for me. I'm not sure that I would have chosen this as a goal, but the required curriculum in this particular school district required that students in kindergarten learn what symmetry and asymmetry were. First time I thought of that, I thought, I'm not really quite sure that that's the way to go, but maybe so. And anyhow, they didn't have a choice because that was one of the big goals. And the teachers thought, there's no point in giving these kids a pre-assessment. They don't know anything about this. None of them know those words, and it'll be frustrating to them and a waste of time for us. And an academic coach who was working with them said, how about if you try this? Teach a lesson on symmetry and let the kids do some hands-on stuff and check to see kind of what they're understanding. And after you've done that for a class period or two, then do a pre-assessment. And it's fine to do a pre-assessment a day or two after you introduce something if there's no way anybody knows about it in advance. So what the teachers decided they'd do was to take a bag, a paper bag, and put in it some actual three-dimensional objects, sometimes some pictures of things, sometimes some sketches. So there might, for example, have been an orange slice in that bag with wrap over it, a picture of a butterfly, a real leaf, a geometric drawing, a pine cone, any number of things, picture of a snowflake. And while the kids were working on other things, the teacher would walk around in the classroom and say, I want you to pull 3 things out of this bag and tell me whether you think the thing that you pull out is an example of symmetry or asymmetry. And so they did that over a couple of days with every student in the class. And they wrote a letter back to the coach. And they said, in the beginning, we thought this was worthless. And all of us said to you, we know our kids, we know what they know, we know who's going to get this and who's not going to get it. But in fact, as we interviewed the kids and they had these things to work with, we found out a lot of things about the kids that we didn't know before. And we also found out that we were really wrong in saying we know where our kids are and we know who they are and we know what to do, because many of them didn't fall in the category we thought they would. It's a great way to think of assessment as something that teaches us and something that helps the kids express their own learning and learn a little better too. Here's a quick pre-assessment for a young child. What's a picture of a leaf? And what words are important to know about a leaf? Could do that as a pre-assessment or an ongoing one. I like this way of thinking about assessing young children. 3 things that I learned about my progress from looking at my feedback today. That's probably not a kindergarten or preschool one, but as you move up the grades, and even in preschool and kindergarten, you can do this with oral work. 3 things that I now know I need to work on. 2 plans I have for making my work stronger. And 1 thing I just might need some help on so that I can meet my goals. I like this because it isn't a just do you have a right answer, but this is kind of what David was getting at, is your brain working on how to think better and how to get your work done better. And can you look at some feedback and say, okay, here's 3 things that I'm doing well. Here are 2 that I'm not quite doing so well. And here's something that I can do to make that work better. And do I have all the resources that I need for it? And I like this one. This is a combination grade 2, grade 3 classroom. And the teacher's job, among others, was to help kids explore different genre of literature that year. And so as the year began down the road a little bit, she gave the kids a survey. And she said, I want you to draw a star next to the kind of reading that you think is the most exciting. And then any of them that you think are kind of okay, it's not that I love them to death, but they're okay. I'm okay with them. I'm good. Put a smiley face. And then any of these kinds of literature that you think are just yucky, draw an arrow downward saying yucky. And I asked the teacher, when you did this, how did you move forward? If a kid said something was yucky, did you just not ask them to read it? And I'm thinking, if they told you something, you need to use it, but that doesn't seem quite right. And she said, oh, no, I didn't do that. If somebody said something was yucky, I made sure that they were in a group working with a piece of literature where everybody else in the group thought it was wonderful. And you'd be amazed at how quickly they changed their minds. So again, we're going to do this one a little bit shorter. And when we come back, we'll move on just a second and we'll be sure, if I don't move on further, that David's got time to work with you. What we've looked at so far is an example of maybe how we can make learning environments invitational, how we can make our curriculum more invitational, how we can make assessment more invitational. We'll be looking at those things in more detail as we go on later. So I'm going to disappear for about a minute. We'll let you know when that minute's up. If you have a question to post in the chat box, do that. If you need to stand up and stretch, do that. Okay, we'll start back in just a second, and if you are game for turning your videos back on, if you turn them off, that would be so helpful. Okay, the last one of the elements that I wanted us to look at, and this is you guys again, is what we actually do in the teaching process to help kids become more engaged with learning, to own it, to get a stake in it. And here are the kinds of things that we should be trying to do based on all the research that we have during that time when we're teaching and the kids are actually learning, trying to make sense of things. So take a look at this again for a minute, and I'll show you one example and then give you to David. The third bullet from the bottom, I think, is really important in all grades, and probably especially when kids are young, so that they can see their lives and the things that they're interested in and the things that they can tell about because they're good with them and have had experiences with them, trying to make sure that what we teach, we have opportunities for kids to connect with what they care about most. So here are a couple of things that I've seen teachers do that strike me as instruction that is attuned to individuals. This is a teacher who said, I was helping a kindergarten teacher assess whether her students could count to 20. One student told me she could count really high. So I said, well, then we better get comfortable. And she sat me on the floor and laid down on my lap like a cat and counted to 112. That's an important thing to know. You know, if you're a kindergarten teacher and you're hoping they can count to 10 or 15 or 20, little kid says, I can do better than that. I can go to 112 and I could keep going if you wanted me to. That child needs attention that lets that child work with that kind of awareness where other students just haven't arrived there yet. They will, just not yet. So a kindergarten teacher who I thought was really clever, her kids like yours ask questions all the time. Why does that drawing look like that? How many of these? What happens to a bird at night? And the kids are wonderful in that way, but as you know, they can also almost take over the world with the questions because they're so curious. She developed this method of saying to the kids, you know, as much as it's fun to talk about every one of those things in here, sometimes we just can't do that. So if there's something you're interested in today and you still want to find out about it tomorrow, here's how you can do that. And she had the kids fill out these big pieces of paper because little hands and need room to do stuff. But here's the question that came to me, or the topic I want to know about it. To find out, here's what I'll read, here's what I'll write, here's who I'll talk to, here's what I'll look at, here's how I'm going to share what I learned, and here's some things I'm going to need in order to succeed with this. And then here's how I want to share what I learned, which was negotiated with the teacher. And when I saw this happening and saw how good the kids got at it, what I realized, because this was after I went to the university, that these are kindergartners working on the dissertation process. Exactly what's supposed to happen in a dissertation. And if we did this kind of inquiry, which again, I know many of you do throughout school, they would be so much better positioned to do deeper thinking in the end. So here are a couple of other things that we won't look at today, but I may share with you on another time when we're starting about some back to school ideas. And here is David. And what he's doing,
Yeah.
by the way, is going back and talking about some of these 5 elements, learning environment, curriculum, assessment, as they appear in brain science. Many other examples he could give, but these are pertinent to those 5 areas, or some of the 5.
Right. Thank you, Carol. One of the things that we learned over the last few years about how the brain learns is the impact of emotions, the impact of how emotions affect attention, how they affect focus, how they affect interest. And the chemistry that's involved is pretty interesting. And what we know, of course, is that if the learning environment, if the student feels welcome, if it's invitational, then the neurotransmitters running through their brain are those that bring about very positive results, very positive feelings. So what do we mean by a positive learning environment? We mean that there's respect between the teacher and student. We mean there's respect between student to student, that the students are happy to be there, that they enjoy the company of their peers and of the teacher, and if they feel like they're learning things and being successful at what they're doing. When that happens, then you get these feel-good chemicals, the body's natural feel-good chemicals, such as dopamine and oxytocin, serotonin, pumping through the brain, providing focus, and giving the student a feeling of, I'm happy to be here, and I think I can learn something here. So the environment of the classroom is really critical to keeping students' attention and focus. Next, Carol. However, if there's a negative environment, and some, teachers, I don't think, go out of their way to try to make a negative environment in the classroom. Sometimes it happens inadvertently. Something happens in the classroom, teachers does something or says something, or a student does something or says something, and all of a sudden the environment changes. By the way, you'll notice I only talk about positive and negative environments. There's no neutral environment. In my opinion, when you get 25 kids in a classroom with a teacher, it's just not neutral. It doesn't take much to tip that balance. If you think of a seesaw in the park, the most difficult position for it is to keep it level, because all it takes is a little gust of wind and down it goes. Same thing in the classroom. In the classroom, the intention should be purposefully planned by the teacher to keep the environment positive. Now, if that doesn't happen and something occurs and shifts the balance the other way, and all of a sudden things change in the classroom, then the chemical balance in the brain changes rapidly. And what happens is that a hormone called cortisol starts pumping into the blood. We always have a little bit of cortisol in the blood, but we get more of it when we get stressed. And once the student feels stressed, cortisol pumps into the brain, and all of a sudden, this is the frontal lobe of the brain. You can see can you see my cursor? Carol, can you see my cursor?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Can you see the cursor?
Oh, no, I don't. Where is it?
Okay.
Oh, I can't see it because I can't see your screen.
Right, okay. So the point is, if you look at the lower right-hand corner, in the healthy brain, by healthy, I mean one that's in a positive learning environment, notice the front of the brain. That's where thinking occurs. That's where problem solving occurs. That's where attention and focus occur. Very active. The red means they're very active and the student's focused. But once the environment changes and the student becomes stressful, then notice what happens right away. On the right, and this just takes a minute, if not less, depending on the age of the student. But once the cortisol starts coming into the bloodstream, then the brain shifts its attention not to the learning, but what it can do to lessen that stress. How can it lower the stress level? And at that point, the learning objective has moved and been brushed aside, and the brain's focusing on this. Now, you may not notice that in the students, the behavior of the student may not change much, but you can be sure that if the environment is negative, then the brain is going to be stressed, learning objective is going to go aside, and the student's brain is going to try to focus on, how do I change stress? How do I lower the stress level here? Well, what's next, Carol? I want to mention too that the brain, my definition of the brain is that it's a lean and mean pattern-making machine. The brain is always looking for patterns. So whenever it's exposed to new learning, it tries to find information from the past, things that they already know, to make connections, to build a pattern, to add to the network. These patterns help the brain give the new learning meaning. And meaning, which is the student saying, what's this got to do with me? How's it relevant to me? Is a critical component of learning. Because you ask teachers, how long do you want the students to remember what they learned today? They'll almost always say forever. But we know that doesn't happen. But in order to increase the amount of learning that will go into long-term memory, then meaning is critical, as a critical component of that. If the student's brain says, now I know what this means for me, then you've got a better chance of learning being remembered. Next slide, Carol. Learning, of course, requires engagement. Engagement is the ability of the student's brain to focus on what's being learned, to focus on how they can make patterns out of what they're learning, and to find meaning. But too often, teachers focus just on one kind of engagement, that's academic. But there are many different kinds of ways that a student engages with the learning. And the more ways that we get students engaged, the higher the likelihood that they'll feel positive in that classroom, the higher the likelihood that they'll learn, the higher the likelihood they'll see meaning in what they're learning, and higher the probability that they'll store that overnight. So what are the different ways in which engagement occurred? First of all, well, one of these are not in order of importance, they're just random, because they're all, to some degree, equally important. These students, personal engagement, as students, I really understand this. This really helps me to do things. And in your grade level, it might be just understanding addition, how addition works. So if I do this, then I can understand how many candy bars to ask my mother for, or how many things I can do by understanding the personal involvement with it. Next one. Then there's cultural engagement. In a classroom that's diverse, you've got different cultures, different forms of music, different art forms, different dances. So cultural engagement is when the student sees connection to the new learning, to their own culture, how this advances my culture, but also how it connects to the cultures of others. We have different music forms, we have different art forms, we have different dances. So it widens, it broadens the learner's understanding of the world around them and their peers. It often improves the respect they have for their peers because they begin to recognize there's more than one way to understand the world. Next one, Carol. This is the one that teachers focus on the most, academic engagement. How do I get the student to focus on the curriculum? We got to cover the curriculum, and then we got to assess whether they know it or not and keep moving ahead. This is not such a driving force in the elementary and pre-K grades, because teachers and pre-K teachers and kindergarten teachers are focused mainly on the growth of the child. They're focused on how the child is changing, how the child is learning. When you get into middle and high school, they're focused on the curriculum. How much stuff do I have to cover? And how quickly do I get to cover it? And how do I assess it? What are the different ways I get grades out of this? But that's just one piece of engagement. Next, Carol. Then we have social engagement. Remember, we talked before that one of the concerns we have with technology is that students are becoming too much device focused for relationships rather than person focused. So anything that we can do in the classroom to help students make connections, face-to-face connections with their peers and with their teachers and with the broader school community, and understand that relationships, deep and lasting relationships occur face-to-face, not face to device. And lastly, Carol, we have emotional engagement. Again, not last, very important. How can the student connect emotions to the new learning? whenever we have emotions connected to the new learning, a different part of the brain lights up. Most of the academic engagement occurs here in the frontal lobe, what we call the rational part of the brain. But the emotional part of the brain is deep inside in what we call the hippocampus and the amygdala. Those structures are very tuned, especially the amygdala, very tuned to emotions. And anytime the teacher can help the student assess and attach emotions to the learning, then much greater that involves another part of the brain and increases dramatically the chances that the student remember. And think of yourself as an adult. We tend to remember the best and worst things that happen to us, because the best and worst things that happen to us are tied to emotions, and therefore the high probability to remember it. I think that's it, Carol.
Yep, got one more.
Okay, move on. I mentioned meaning, but I just want to reemphasize that if we expect students to remember curriculum, we have to be sure to understand that the brain uses two criteria in order to decide, among others, in order to decide how to store information. Not talking about emotions here, not talking about social engagement, we're talking about information, which is what basically curriculum is. Move on. Next. When we're learning something new, information comes to working memory, which is a temporary memory. That's the one I mentioned earlier today, that the capacity of that is going down because students are using this for memory more than they're using this for memory. Anyway, we process that in working memory. Now the question is, at the end of the learning episode, the brain says, what do I do with this? Do I keep it or do I throw it out? Because other stuff is coming. And we believe the brain makes that decision on information based on two criteria. Number one, sense. Carol? One criterion is sense. Do I understand it? Does this fit in the world as I understand it up to now? Does it fit into the patterns that my brain's already making? And we find that most teachers do a pretty good job, in fact, a very good job at trying to translate the curriculum so that it makes sense. What we don't do as good a job in is the next thing. All right, the learner says, I understand it, but what's it got to do with me? Carol? Yeah, so what? Why do I need to know this? And you probably don't get that so much in the younger grades, in the earlier years. But sometimes students say, why do I need to know this? What's it got to do with me? How important is this? Do I need to know it really? What they're saying is that they haven't yet attached meaning to it. And so the teacher has to find a way to attach meaning to the learning. And remember, because we get diverse brains in the classroom, it may be meaningful for one student, it may not be meaningful for another. So that becomes a challenge. And that's why it's very important to know your students, to do that pre-assessment, to understand their likes, dislikes, and the kind of background that they have. Meaning is really critical to learning, to remembering. Okay.
Oh, yeah. One of my favorite.
Yeah,
ideas.
Having been a middle and high school teacher, I know how, especially as we get toward the end of the school year, they get so much more stuff to cover, and they say, I'll never make it. So they begin to pick up speed. You go to a high school classroom toward the end of the school year, it sounds like an auction, blah, 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 because they're trying to cover so much stuff. What we find is covering stuff often doesn't have meaning. And so curriculum races are not friendly. Let it rip, Carol. There you go. Yeah, curriculum races, not friendly at all. Not brain friendly. Brains don't have enough time to deal with this. And so you really waste your time. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, David. One of the first things that I remember learning about the brain many years ago now that really stuck with me all these years is the thing David was talking about with the connection with emotions in learning. And the phrase that the person used was emotions are the gateway to learning. So if we can surprise a kid or make them giggle or make them wonder or evoke some empathy because of something we're reading or to get them jazzed, the memory opens up. So that whole notion of tapping into us emotions is great. And with the younger learners, they're open to all of those things. For those of you who teach the grades further up the chain, they are at a point where they have enough of the discovery of the world so that we can really try to tap into those emotions in a much broader and deeper span. So I'm hoping that you have some questions for us and that you perhaps have put some in the chat box. I'm going to pause for just a minute again in case you have something that you'd like to ask, but haven't put it in the chat box. And then Alex, if you can field those questions for us, that would be really helpful. And once we start that, we can, I can quit sharing and everybody can come up on the screen so we can see each other, and that would probably be good too. So are you with us, Alex? You're not on my screen, so I can't quite tell.
No, Carol, I think Alex is not.
You had to go somewhere?
Right
Okay.
now. But
Okay.
if you need some help, we're here willing to help you.
Okay, great. Can you check the chat box and see if there are any questions in there for us, Natalie? Natalia, sorry.
I'm checking right now.
I don't see any.
We don't have any questions in the chat. I don't know if there's any question. I'm gonna move to Spanish. No sé si hay alguna pregunta para nuestros conferencistas de hoy. Si quieren pueden ponerla en el chat o pueden hacerla levantando la mano.
Looks like we did such a good job, Carol,
I
that
think so.
Or it's late in the day.
or they're totally confused.
Yeah, may need a siesta instead of a question box.
Here comes one.
Yeah, here we have a question. It says, okay, what's the difference between differentiation and inclusive education?
Hey, oh, well, that's a good question, and people find that a little fuzzy a lot of the times. Inclusive education is an approach to education which simply says kids are better served if they can learn in an environment that's much more like the world that they're going to live in. All kinds of people, all sorts of strengths that people bring, different cultures, different languages. In a way, inclusion says, let's build the world that we would like to have in a classroom. And so inclusion just simply advocates for students who might well, not simply, it's not simple, but it advocates to include students in general classrooms who might not have been in those classrooms before. Inclusion frequently has to do with students who have physical challenges or emotional challenges or social issues. And I never have been anywhere where anyone who's an advocate for inclusion says every kid of every kind should be in every classroom and there shouldn't be any more resources for those kids outside of a classroom. But what they are saying is many students would fare very well if we had them in inclusive classrooms, if we welcome them and said, of course, this is just adding more mix and more of the way of the world in here. And we've worked with a lot of kids with different needs, and we can work with anybody else that comes in with us. So inclusion, just that term, is an approach to teaching students who are often segregated, some or all of their school day, and advocating that they go into a classroom that has a general mix of students. Differentiation is a method of teaching. And I think differentiation is important no matter what kind of classroom you have, even if you still have in your school kids that are segregated for one reason or another. Our state superintendent in Virginia used to say he thought the only time there was such a thing as a homogeneous classroom was when he was in a room by himself. And after the people would get what he was saying and kind of giggle a little bit, and he'd say, come to think of it, I'm not even sure about that. And I'm not the same. I was never the same student in Latin as I was in German. I was not the same student in geometry or in algebra as I was in algebra. I'm seldom the same student in the morning that I am late in the evening. I'm not the same student as if I'm feeling well versus when I'm feeling lousy. So even just me, I'm not a homogeneous person. And so what we're advocating for through differentiation is that any differences that we bring into the classroom that affect how we learn ought to be a part of the teacher's thinking, and we get better at that like anything else that we study over time. And what we're saying is we can have more of the world together and learn from one another if we have methods of dealing with those things. And so differentiation is a method of teaching and learning that is important in any classroom and just becomes even more important in an inclusive classroom because the span of,
Carol,
yeah.
Carol, we have several more questions. If you
Oh,
click
good,
on the
great.
chat,
Go for it.
if you click on the chat box, Carol,
Okay, so I'm
they'll
gonna
come
do
up on your
this.
screen
Okay, yeah.
and three of them are in English, so it's great.
The second question, I think, let me see if I'm interpreting it the way Emily meant when she wrote it in here. We plan subjects in teams with other teachers from our grade level. Any suggestions for differentiation when we share planning with other teachers, knowing that sometimes our classes are very different in terms of learners? I like lots of part of that. I like the assumption that you're going to plan in teams, which I think is really powerful if you use it right. It was so helpful to me to hear other teachers' ideas and see something they thought of. And I think, why didn't I think of that 3 years ago? You know, why am I just now hearing that? But it can also be really important to have minds together and saying, well, let's look at many ways to do this. And once we've got a plan, if we're going to differentiate something, how about if I differentiate this part and you bring in some stuff for this and you try this out first in your classroom. And so you can actually share the load of work in that way, I think, in a way that makes teaching more powerful. So I don't think the idea of differentiation working in teams should be now suddenly we have to become all the same people and do everything exactly in the same way as each other. What I think that teamwork is best for is stretching one another's thinking and supporting one another when we can. But when one teacher says, you know, my class, because of X, is going to need a much more hands-on approach than it seems like yours is. So how about if I work with some hands-on stuff that's going to be big in my classroom and then share it with the other three of you? You can use it with some of the students that you're working with. I think team planning should not be just me, doesn't matter much what I think, but not to make everybody alike, but to support each other in thinking about how to address differences in classrooms and to do that in a variety of ways with the understanding that there are some things that should be in common to everybody, but those are not necessarily, or I would think not usually instructional decisions. Does that help
The
at all?
next one, Carol, I
Yeah.
think has to do with work you've done with Jay Ty.
I'm sorry, I missed that.
Look at the next question.
Okay.
I think it has to do with the understanding by design work you've
Oh, yeah.
done.
No,
with Ty.
no, yeah, differentiation in universal design, which is a little bit different than understanding. Well, it's a big bit different than understanding by design. Let me try this in English. I'm going to get here with this in a minute. Both differentiation and universal design for learning are approaches to teaching effectively in heterogeneous settings. They have exactly the same purpose. How can we have diverse learners in a classroom? And how can these methods give you guidance for how we might go about dealing with those differences? So you might say this, I don't think this serves much purpose, but you could say that differentiation is a kind of universal design. Universal design is kind of differentiation. They really are going in exactly the same direction. They are not opposites. They're not talking about things that are oppositional to one another. They do have a little bit of a different history. And so that different history gives them a little bit of a different personality, but not a different intent. So universal design for learning began with people who believe in inclusion. And the first students that they were focused on much working with that model were students who have learning challenges. And so Universal Design for Learning began by saying, if you have students with learning issues, here are some things you can do to help them. Differentiation started in basically, and of course, all of this stuff's been done for a million years, but the iteration of differentiation that I've worked with started in a public school with very mixed ability classrooms, but not necessarily a whole lot of inclusion students. And so we started with how do we work with everybody in here, not how do we start by working with kids who are hurting and then move on out from that. Understanding Universal Design for Learning began with a more primary grade approach. Differentiation has always intended to cover K through 12 and college. Universal Design for Learning started with technology more than most other groups because technology is really helpful to kids who have learning issues. Differentiation has always seen learning tools as something that every kid can use. Would not say that I'm not going to use a tool that would be really helpful to a kid who needs to speak writing, but it was a more general approach to technology. Differentiation, again, has been a K-12 and now K-University kind of thing. So all those differences make them have a slightly different slant, but the two models are very compatible and they're going in exactly the same direction. I think differentiation has a slightly bigger tent and it has a slightly different history and a slightly different emphasis. But I have many colleagues who work with UDL, and they have colleagues that work with differentiation. They're after exactly the same thing. They have exactly the same mission.
I think the third question, Carol, is what you'll be dealing with in future sessions.
How a differentiated classroom might look is exactly where we're going after this. We also will talk about the next one. We can't teach everything. And how do we decide what to teach and how to teach it? And that's a big part of the curriculum decision. We can't cover all that stuff that's in the manual. And if we did, it would be so shallow, we'd break right through it. It would make no sense and have no relevance to kids. So one of the things we'll talk about some is how you already go about deciding what you are going to teach, how to put this together so it's most powerful for kids. And I'll be suggesting to you some ways that you can think about that and show you some examples, but you also will have your own examples to share there.
I'd like to add two. This may not be so applicable to pre-K and kindergarten, but the curriculums have the tendency to keep adding things to them. We keep adding and adding, but we never take anything out. And so you have more to cover in the same amount of time. And the only way you can do that is to feel frustrated that I can't cover everything, or move along so quickly that you're just covering stuff. So what I often suggest when this happens, and it happens a lot, especially in the middle and upper grades, is to do what we call selective abandonment. Selective abandonment means all the teachers and teacher helpers who teach the same subject or grade levels get together, maybe during the summer or some other professional development time, and say, let's prioritize everything that we teach from the most important to the least important, and put them in order. Now you'll have some discussion. Some people will say, no, this is really important, but eventually you can come to terms and saying, okay, this list looks pretty good. And then what I suggest is, especially with middle and high school, is just cut off the last 20%. Nobody will miss it. If it's way down there, just get rid of it. And don't necessarily replace it, but spend more time going deeper and more meaningful into the stuff that's left. And that can make a big difference. Just curriculum sometimes like a vacuum cleaner. It just sucks up everything. And no one ever empties the bag. And so from time to time, I think that's necessary.
And I'll try to show you a couple of ways that teachers have done the kind of thing David's talking about and where it took them. I don't think you all are so terribly far from this. I think many of you work in this kind of an arena already, but we will talk about that a little bit more, and I'll try to share some examples with you. The last comment that's here that Matthias wrote is as good a way to summarize, and actually over the years has become my philosophy of teaching. Teachers' attitude is everything. Planning must go toward understanding and meaningful learning. The environment motivates kids or demotivates kids. If we want assessment to be a part of learning, we have to give kids multiple ways to share with us what they know, and we have to teach them to be better learners. I'm going to talk with you about a way of thinking about differentiation. I call it 3D differentiation. And one of those dimensions that I have come to believe is the most important one is the teacher. You guys are the keepers of everything. And that's a heavy thing to carry. It's not, okay, you're supposed to be able to dance on the ceiling all day, every day for 180 or 190 days or whatever it is. But you have such opportunity. And it is you really who is the catalyst for the very best things that can happen for kids. And someday, as David says, we say the wrong thing or it turns out differently than we meant, and then we mess it up. And that's hurtful, but it's not fatal unless we give up. You know, we have to just keep coming back and saying, how do I do these things that are in Matthias's comment? So I guess that's really why it's maybe valuable for us to have some time for you to talk to each other, to ask us questions, for us to share with you some ideas, so that you become better informed, more engaged, more excited about the year starting. You don't have to be really excited now about the year starting. You need some time away, but eventually to say, man, you know, I have a really cool job. I get to go to school and teach the coolest kids in the world. All those brains, they're right there for me to help shape. And I get to teach amazing content that should open up to us how the world works and show kids that learning is just the most important of the human gifts that we have. Pretty cool job. And I want to make that happen. And when teachers say that and start doing those things at the end down there, magic happens.
Let me add one thing
Without
too,
paying.
as we close out. And that is, I'm not sure what it's like in Colombia, but here very often when people say, someone say, what do you do? And they say, I'm a teacher. They, oh, okay. Did you see the game last night? Or they move on. In other words, oh, you're teaching. They either feel sorry for you, or they're not interested in what you do, and it settles like that. I tell teachers, you know, you are brain changers. You change, as Carol said, everything you do in the classroom has the potential for changing kids' brains. And so next time someone says, what do you do? Say, I'm a brain changer. And that's going to be a very different conversation, because now they're going to say, what? What do you mean by
Then
that?
they'll really look at you like you're crazy, but it is a great conversation starter.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, it's 4 o'clock, a little after 4, I mean 3, your time.
Yeah.
I think we're done.
So let me make the suggestion to you that suggestions that you have for our getting together and really actually working with concrete things that you might do, talk with Alex and some other folks that will engineer that. If you have requests, if you have issues you'd like us to address, if you have concerns, be real sure to give those things to somebody who will talk with us so that we are aiming in a direction that is most promising and powerful for you. And again, the next time we're together, what we'll be doing is trying to really get down to some of the elements that you probably will be thinking about as school starts, and ways that you can actually concretely address those for diverse learners. So help us out by giving your input to Alex or other folks that you contact. And
We
thank you
hope that
for
you
your
found this a useful experience. We've enjoyed working with you, and wish you the best of luck.
Thank
very
you
happy
very
summer to
much.
you.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, David, for this evening. It's been wonderful working with you, and we'll keep in touch to continue this work in August.
Great. Thank you so much, Natalia.
Meanwhile, have a great vacation.
And we'll see you when it's just about over.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.